And even in Morocco and Jordan, which enjoy a relatively positive reputation with US foreign policy circles, they have cracked down hard on critics themselves, imprisoning peaceful protest leaders, as well as social media commentators, artists, and journalists. The Moroccan courts, in fact, have levied sentences as long as 20 years for peaceful activism. Which brings me to the recommendations that we can make for what the US can do. Because those countries, Morocco, Jordan, and several others, are allies of the United States and nevertheless are infringing on human rights. So, put simply, the US government should reassess the policy mistakes that it have made in the past that have exacerbated human rights abuses in the MENA region, and it shouldn't repeat them. And that is stating the obvious, but it is apparently not so obvious when it comes to US foreign policy because it continues to make mistakes.
The US does, however, have an absolute legal, ethical, and national interest and obligation to end its support for systematically abusive governments in the region. This is where we must draw a real red line. Let me not leave out, only because of the pleas of so many who have reached out to me in anticipation of this hearing, to call out Jordan, another unelected monarchy, whose stability apparently hangs by a thread. We are concerned by the detention of Prince Hamza outside of any judicial process, and King Abdullah calling this a house arrest and a family matter doesn't make it legal. Even princes in the Middle East apparently need human rights protections. They are certainly entitled to them as human beings, first and foremost.
But where did we go wrong? Might I just throw in Jordan? Because I'm surprised to hear of suppression in Jordan, because we would always, the United States always felt comfortable in deporting people to Jordan. I don't like deporting people, but they'd always say, well, they can go to Jordan. So where did we go wrong, if you would? Thank you.
And you highlighted a lot of the struggle for human rights across the region, and you asked a very important question of where did we go wrong, which I'd like to sort of tackle first. We went wrong by failing to really understand the needs of the people of the region. This is a part of the world that has been looking for greater human rights, freedom of the press, freedom to organize, freedom to move about, worship freely without fear of repression and arrest, as many of the other witnesses have brought up. Instead, the United States policy, largely for the past several decades, has been to support relatively autocratic governments that have actually continued to suppress these very human rights that the people of the region have been demanding for quite some time. And I think that your example of that catalyst of the young man who set himself alight in Tunisia that sparked the Arab Spring, and the numerous self-immolations that have occurred since across the region, was just a demonstration of that frustration reaching a boiling point. When you couple that with failing economies, endemic corruption, in a sense, a lack of a future for the many young people of the region, you saw these mass protests break out, and that fear, that seal of fear that kept people from organizing and from taking to the streets, it was gone. And it hasn't really come back to a certain extent, which is why we continue to see various bouts of unrest that continue to bubble up in various countries in the region, including in Iraq and Lebanon today, and even in Iran. And so ultimately what the United States can do is completely overhaul the way it looks at the Middle East and North Africa. It needs to take away the security lens that it views the region, solely focused on anti-terrorism efforts, focused on keeping things quiet, so to speak, and instead elevate the concerns of the people when our elected officials are traveling to the region, when the executive branch is visiting the monarchies of Jordan, of Saudi Arabia, of other Gulf countries, as they will likely be doing the next several days, from my understanding. We have to make sure that human rights are elevated in the conversation, that the killing of Khashoggi was wrong, and he's not the first person to have been killed and ordered to have been killed by a Middle Eastern government. In fact, there have been thousands and thousands of people like him who have been targeted and assassinated and killed, and it's still continuing today.
Thank you. And let me ask Ms. Whitson with the, I'm sorry, let me ask Sarah Holwinski of Human Rights Watch, I believe is here.
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
That same question.
Yeah, terrific. It's a great question. I'm going to answer very simply to a very complicated question, which is what did the US do wrong? And I will just say simply that it has not been consistent. Human rights law, international law, sets a standard. It is a consistent standard, but the United States itself has not been consistent in adhering to that law, nor in requiring its allies to adhere to that law and those standards. And so what I would say going forward is that the United States cannot treat its allies and adversaries differently when it comes to human rights. And should always have human rights at the table when negotiating or dealing diplomatically with other countries. That does not mean that human rights will always rule the day over economic or other interests, but rather that human rights should be a primary consideration. And I think if it were from administration to administration, you would see more consistency, you would see more trust, and you would certainly see more human rights norms built up over time.
Thank you. I want to make a comment, but I want to ask Ms. Whitson, because you've described conditions of human rights catastrophic and with internationalized armed conflicts. And my heart is pained about not only the Mideast, I know that's what we're focusing on, but the extent of Boko Haram in Africa, which are obviously two T's of the movement out of the Mideast and Northern Africa, and the warlike conflicts on the continent. Rather than seeing the 21st century calm, we're seeing a 21st century surge. But if you would talk about what leverage the United States possesses to improve human rights situation in the region. And I'd also like you to add, is the United Nations, can that be an honest broker or a complement to what we're trying to do? And I want to add to this point that you have just made, Ms. Holwinski, and I hope I haven't abused your name. I apologize, and I don't know if Stephen is there as well, but I hope I haven't totally abused it. I don't know if I'm supposed to say Holowinski. Am I correct? Okay.
It can actually go either way, but yeah.
Okay. All right. You just gave me a initiative legislation. I've got to look at it, and that is regarding the idea of the administrations, plural, having human rights at the table in these discussions, because I've been overseas on Codels, and you're the skunk at the party if you're sitting down at the end of the table and you want to congressional delegations and you're internationally and you raise your hand. I'd like to ask about the human rights record. And you're almost, with a sense of humor, Mr. Chairman, co-chairman, you're eyeballed out the room. Because we're supposed to be talking trade, or we're supposed to be talking issues dealing with international relationships. But my concern is that we do have human rights on the table. I think we'd be better off for it. But Ms. Whitson, if you would give us your idea about the conflicts and where we are in the region.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership on human rights and so many other important fronts. I'm a huge fan of yours. I guess I would look at this issue a little bit differently and focusing on your question about leverage and American leverage for human rights reforms. My view is that the US, in fact, has very little leverage to demand or extract human rights reforms. And the notion that we would leverage military assistance to authoritarian, abusive, apartheid governments and somehow use that military assistance to cajole them to make human rights reforms is really nowhere supported in the facts or the evidence. And in fact, that notion of conditionality and leverage, the record is very clear that it basically never works. And I think we have to come to terms with the reality that these governments have no interest in reforming or changing, because their existence, their authoritarianism, their unelected status depends on repressing their population. They would not be in power if they liberalized or democratized or allowed free speech or provided equal rights. And so we have to make sure that we are not supporting these governments, because that runs counter to our own human rights responsibilities under US law and international law. We may not be able to fix the conflicts in the region. We don't have the credibility to fix the conflicts of the region. We have been the creator of conflicts in the region, like in Iraq. We've been active participants in the war in Yemen. I don't want the United States to decide how it's going to fix the Middle East. I want the United States to stop harming the Middle East by military support to abusive governments in the region. That's the best and most important thing we can do. We should rely on multilateral institutions like the United Nations to approach issues of human rights in a multilateral fashion and in a consistent fashion, as my colleague Sarah was referring to. But to selectively target and sanction and punish states like Iran and even Syria in ways that are disastrous for the populations of Iran and Syria, while we are participating in the devastation of the children of Yemen, literally providing the bombs that are raining down on schools and clinics and hospitals in Yemen, it doesn't make sense. It's not consistent, and so it fails. Really what we have to do is to normalize the very abnormal relationship the US has with the Middle East, with more troops, more military bases, more military assistance, more military sales than any other country in the world. That's quite abnormal. Let's have a normal economic relationship. Let's have a normal relationship where we have counterterrorism cooperation, where we buy access to VIP passage at the Suez Canal, or any of the reasons that are in our security interest. But let's not make it abnormal by providing military assistance to authoritarian, abusive apartheid states in the region.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for, may I squeeze just one point in? I'd like to do so in my conclusion. I think this has been an enormously well-rounded hearing, and one that is both important and overdue, to be frank with you, because we have consistently pre-COVID traveled to the Mideast, and we have traveled to those who are allies, and we know what the discussions have been. I happen to want to save Jordan. I know Jordan from the perspective of being the largest, being the country with the largest number of individuals that are not Jordanians, that they have been a place for Palestinians and others. As I indicated, I am a real live witness to when Americans, when persons are deported who have no terrorist issues, they have immigration issues, they are promptly deported to Jordan. And I had a Palestinian family who had done nothing but be Muslim during 9/11, and neighbors called and said they're terrorists. They're meeting in their house. They just happen to be a big family, 7 children. They were deported to Jordan. And so here we are with news representations of what is happening in Jordan. Someone who wants to take that question as to how do we help Jordan? How do we help the king? What is going to be Jordan's future on some of the issues that I've been hearing? Does anyone have?
Well, I'll chime in briefly. I'll chime in briefly and then cede to my colleague, Stephen, who I know has covered this much more closely. I think it's very important that we avoid confusing helping the king, who is not an elected democratic leader of this country, who is responsible for grave repression in the country, just most recently canceling the teachers' union, arresting teacher strikers, and rules by a much more repressive fist than we in the United States are aware of. In fact, currently he is holding his own brother under so-called house arrest without any judicial process, without ever having brought him to court on any charges, just because he's the king and he can do it. So I think we need to reevaluate our military support to the monarchy in Jordan and really critically examine whether this is military support that is helping the Jordanian people. I think there are much, much better ways to help the Jordanian people. And I commend you for recognizing that the Jordanian government has played a vital role in providing security for Syrian refugees, over 1 million, as well as Palestinian refugees for many decades.
Well, you opened it up, Ms. Whitson, in the way that I wanted it to be responded to, because obviously when I said the king, I was hoping, or I was suggesting, can we help him undo what it looks like he is now moving more extensively toward? And obviously, as you well know, he was most praised. His family has been most praised as that beacon, or that place that is different in the region. And now I see a conspicuous and visible deterioration. Let me see if there's someone else that may be, including Mr. Nassif.
Mr. McInerney and Mr. Nassif might want to respond.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you so very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you, Congresswoman. I'd be happy to jump in. First, I would just fully agree with what Sarah Lee Whitson just said. That I think the important thing is that we should try to help Jordan. We should try to help the Jordanian people. We should also try to help the many refugees from other countries in Jordan. You mentioned Palestinians, also many Syrians and Iraqis as well. So we should try to help the people. We shouldn't confuse that. We shouldn't with helping the king at all times. Now, the reality is that the Jordanian absolute monarchy dictatorship has steadily become more and more repressive over the 20 plus years of the king's rule. And the king and his regime receive extensive support from the United States. It's one of the largest recipients of U.S. assistance in the world at more than $1 billion annually. And I do believe that this should provide us leverage with the king if we are willing to use it. And unfortunately, sadly, most of the time, U.S. policymakers are not willing to use the leverage that our relationship with these regimes, I think does provide. I think we need to make very clear that it's in the interest of the United States, and most of all in the interest of the Jordanian people, that the king and his regime absolutely reverse ground on this steady escalation of political closure and repression of rights and repression of any dissenting voices. One of the sad realities in the Middle East is that most of these dictatorships are not only brutal abusers of human rights, but they are also incompetent regimes incapable of meeting the needs of their people. And I think we've seen that very clearly in Jordan, which is, including over the past year, we've seen disastrous government response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in recent weeks, we've seen the government really target and arrest and confine to house arrest anyone who has criticized their response. I think the reality is that the way to solve the problems of Jordan or in other countries is to allow the citizens to kind of engage in finding solutions and not to silence any dissenting voices. And these regimes are brittle and insecure, and the king is terrified of his own population and of any dissenting voices or criticism. I think we need to see a very, very different approach from the king and his dictatorship, and if not, then I think we should shift our support away from the king and find ways to directly engage in support with the Jordanian people, and as I said, also with other refugee populations present in Jordan.
Thank you all so very much. I think I don't want to use the terminology, but we have our marching orders, we have our roadmap here.
Yeah, and I'm trying to see, did Mr. Nassif want to respond? On 11, I didn't. I'm trying to.
We don't want to leave you out, Mr. Nassif.
I'm trying to follow everybody on my Hollywood squares here, and it's.
No, thank you all. No, nothing more to add except to reiterate a very important point that I think all of the witnesses have brought up thus far, which is that the United States has leverage over many of these countries, and we do not use that leverage nearly enough. And I think that going forward, when Congressman Sheila Jackson Lee asked that wonderful question of what could we do going forward, and you bring up marching orders, I think a part of those orders should be to use that leverage and make sure that human rights is a part of the conversation, not in a cosmetic way, but in a substantive way.